Hi, here we are, Psychology 2, and we're going to look at psychological disorders. Now, what's a really important disclaimer, I got this when I was in my own psychology class back in the year, and when I took abnormal psychology, they promised to say, and I'm going to say it here too, is no self-diagnosis. You're not a professional. You don't make your own diagnosis. Most everybody will have some sort of related stuff, to psychological disorders. Unless you have been diagnosed by a professional, where it's been written and diagnosed and conditions and medication related things, you do not have a disorder. Now, we may have considerations there, well, I do something like that. It's not the same unless you've been diagnosed, because the conditions by which diagnoses are met are not the same as of exhibiting a particular thing once or twice in a week or two or a month. There needs to be specific conditions, and very few people meet the conditions. So please don't self-diagnose. Having said that, we're only going to look at this very briefly, and that this is a psychology course, not an abnormal psychology course. I'll be teaching an online abnormal psychology course in the fall, I believe, 2016. So what we're going to cover here is, how do you define what is abnormal? And we'll do a very simple, characteristic conditions about which abnormal and not abnormal make sense. And then we're going to touch base on anxiety disorders. And I'm going to go through some examples of anxiety disorders and what are the symptoms. And then we're going to look at somatoform disorders. And then lastly, we'll look at dissociative disorders. And that's all we're going to cover. Now, there will be a number of disorders within each category. And then in the second part, we'll look at schizophrenia, mood disorders, and personality disorders. All right? So hope you enjoy this. This is somewhat of a very brief, light introduction to abnormal psychology. And then next week, the week after, so week 12 and 13, we'll look at therapies. All right, so let's get on with this, and good luck, and please don't self-diagnose. All right, let's get going. Okay, if we're going to define a psychological disorder, we need to know whether or not something is abnormal or not. And now, psychological disorders are mental processes and or behavior patterns that cause emotional distress and a substantial impairment in functioning. So if we consider what is abnormal, is the behavior considered strange within the person's own culture? And what is normal in some cultures is abnormal in others. And so there are some considerations. One, does the behavior cause personal distress? Experiencing considerable emotional distress without any life experience that warrants it. Now, I've put a picture of me outside in my shorts in the winter time because a lot of people think that I'm abnormal, but it doesn't cause me personal distress. So just on that condition alone, what I do is not abnormal for me. Now, is the behavior maladaptive? Does it lead to healthy or impaired functioning? Washing your hands before you eat is healthy. Washing your hands 100 times daily is maladaptive. Well, you could look at my picture and say, well, that's got to be maladaptive. Well, one, it doesn't cause me any distress. It doesn't make me unhealthy. Some would argue it's maladaptive because it's inappropriate to wear shorts in the wintertime because it's unhealthy. Well, if it's unhealthy, I shouldn't be as healthy as I am. And then we look at, is the person a danger to oneself or others? A priority consideration in committing someone to a mental hospital is that there is some danger to themselves or others. Now, some people would argue that I'm a danger to myself in wearing shorts. What you can't see in my car is that I have a pair of long pants, sort of winter pants, if you will, splash pants in the car, that if I have gone off the road, and I have twice in the last 30 years, I've put them on if I've needed to. If it was cold enough, then I needed to, and I've had long pants there. I just don't choose and haven't needed to use them. So I'm not a danger to myself, and I'm certainly not a danger to others, I don't think. Certainly not because I'm wearing shorts. No one has died as a result of seeing me in shorts in the winter and going, oh my God, it's making me so cold that I'm going to die. And then fourthly, is the person legally responsible for his or her acts? The term insanity is not used by mental health professionals. It's a legal term used by courts. Mass murderer Jeffrey Dahmer was ruled legally responsible, but his behaviors were clearly abnormal. I am legally responsible for my acts, and this is a choice that I make, and I legally am responsible for them. So, whether you agree or not, I am not abnormal. Now, technically, we have a more authoritative approach, and what psychologists and psychiatrists were used to define and classify and diagnose disorders, psychological disorders, and it's called the DSM. Now, we have the DSM-5. It was brought out, I think it was about 2013, I think, in the spring. It was first published in 1952. The DSM-4 was published in 2000, and in it there are in the neighborhood of some 300 specific disorders listing along with criteria to make a diagnosis. And it's used by therapists, researchers, mental health workers, and insurance companies. And it basically tries to create a common language between professionals. Now, it works on a multi-dimensional diagnostic system. You're seeing axis 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so these different axes, a person would be diagnosed or have descriptors apply to each axis in order to make a diagnosis for whatever psychological disorder. Now, we're going to start with anxiety disorder. Now, I know, because I've been here a long time at the college, and I've worked in the field as a counselor for persons with disabilities and with people with psychological disorders, and I know a lot of people self-diagnose. And so I'm going to emphasize again, don't self-diagnose. Everybody has felt anxiety at some time. The difference about what is anxiety disorder and having anxiety are two very different things. Now, anxiety disorders are psychological disorders characterized by frequent, fearful thoughts about what might happen in the future. Some anxiety is normal and appropriate. Stressful situations that can and do respond to in useful and meaningful manners. I mean, getting ready for a test is anxiety producing. So anxiety is not an abnormal condition. It's part of a normal life experience. About 2 million, or 29% of the Canadian population, will touch on a general anxiety disorder, panic attack, phobic, or obsessive compulsive disorder. That's a large collection of conditions, and about 29% of the population will touch or experience some of these at some point in their life potentially. Now, general anxiety disorder itself is excessive anxiety or worry that a person finds it difficult to control and manage. You can worry about money, health of yourself, or health of others. It affects other parts of your life. Remember the defining psychological disorder section. You know, you need to meet all of those 4 elements, and these conditions, this area of really, fearful thoughts and excessive worrying, need to last for 6 months or more. This doesn't mean for a few days and then not see it for a few days or a few months and then see it again. This means pretty regularly, if not daily, for 6 months. So that's why I'm saying a lot of times we self-diagnose on inappropriate or limited information. You experience the symptoms: tired, irritable, tense, difficulty sleeping, trembling, palpitations, sweating, nausea, diarrhea, and tends to affect women more than men, about 5.7% of the North American population. Typically what's prescribed are antidepressant drugs, and cognitive and behavior therapies would be considered very helpful. And we'll go through the therapies in our next chapter. Now, anxiety disorders can be broken down into some subcategories. So People with reoccurring panic attacks may be diagnosed with panic disorder. Now, panic attacks are episodes of overwhelming anxiety, fear, or terror. Now, this could be about 2% of men and about 5% of women in the United States, and roughly the same as in Canada. The symptoms include a pounding heart, uncontrollable trembling or shaking, sensations of choking or smothering like you can't breathe, feeling as if you are going to die, and feeling as if you're going crazy. Now, people who have experienced panic attacks, and I've been beside people who have, it's overwhelming. It's not spinning in your head a little bit going, geez, I hope I don't get into trouble, and having that last for maybe a half an hour. Panic attacks are much more extreme on the physiological as well as psychological level. The more catastrophic the belief, the more intense the panic. Recurring panic attacks can be diagnosed as panic disorder. Anxiety about the occurrence or consequences of future attacks, a significant health and social consequences, frequent visits to the doctor's office and emergency rooms, increased risk for abuse of alcohol and other drugs, and the treatment in this case could also be medication or psychotherapy. It can be quite a devastating experience. Now, some other forms of anxiety disorders include phobias. These are essentially persistent, irrational fears of some specific object, situation, or activity that poses little or no real danger. So phobics realize their fear is irrational, but feel compelled to avoid the feared situation anyway. The two we're going to touch on briefly here is agoraphobia. This is an intense fear of being in a situation in which escape is not possible, or in which help would not be available. If one experienced overwhelming anxiety or panic attack, life is planned around avoiding fearful situations. You may not leave home unless accompanied by a friend, a family member, or when severe, or even when it's severe, or even then you may not even go out. Women are 4 times more likely than men to be diagnosed. It typically begins in early adult years with panic attacks and leads to avoidance of places or situations where attacks occur. Attacks affects physical, psychological, social, occupational, interpersonal, and economic life. Now, the social phobia, this is an irrational fear and avoidance of any social or performance situation in which one might be embarrassed or humiliate themselves in front of others. There'll be an excessive amount of shaking, blushing, sweating, appearing clumsy, foolish, and incompetent. Most common type, it's one of the more common types of anxiety disorders. It may take form of performance anxiety. 1/3 only fear speaking in public. In extremes, it can affect performance at work, limit education, or restrict social life. Many turn to alcohol or tranquilizers to reduce symptoms effects. Now, some other phobias that can exist for people, and there's quite a few of them actually, so there are more what are called specific phobias. And so it's marked by a fear of a specific object or situation. A general label for any phobia other than agoraphobia or social phobia. When facing the phobic item or situation, people will experience intense anxiety, even to the point of shaking or screaming. They'll go to great lengths to avoid the feared object or situation. Phobic items can include, and this is ordered by frequency of occurrence, situational phobias like elevators, airplanes, enclosed spaces, tunnels, fear of natural environment, storms or water, animal phobias, either fear of snakes, dogs, insects, mice, blood injection injury phobia, which is a fear of seeing blood or receiving an injection, and then, of course, claustrophobia, closed spaces, acrophobia, heights, are the most frequently treated by therapists. Now, the causes, well, general anxiety disorder and social phobias are manifestations of the big 5 personality trait of neuroticism. They have negative outlook on life and are emotionally unstable. Also risk risk factor for development of social phobias or classical conditioning developed social phobia. Now, classical conditioning would be experiences where you have had an association. We'll simplify it. You've had a very loud noise associated with a dog. So the dog gets associated with the startle of a loud noise. That association, that when you see a dog, is the experience of the startle of a loud noise, gets associated. So the fear of dogs gets linked. So the traumatic childhood experience with a feared object or situation gets linked. Or it's observational learning, where a child who hears a parent talk about a frightening encounter with a dog may develop the same fear for dogs. Now, in the same category of anxiety disorders are obsessive compulsive disorders. And anxiety disorders in which person suffers recurrent obsessions or compulsions, compulsions, or both. Now, an obsession is a persistent, involuntary thought, image, or impulse that invades the consciousness and causes great distress, contamination by germs, whether they perform a specific action, turning off the stove or locking the door, aggression, religion, sex. Now, these obsessions are really invasive, and this person will even be aware of their irrationality, but will feel compelled, nonetheless, to act on them. This is something that will happen many times in the day, and over every single day, and over months before it's being diagnosed as obsessive compulsive. So that's just the obsessions. So for example, with the locked door, I've known people who will go back to lock their door 7 times, will leave and come back and do it 7 more times, will leave and come back and do it 7 more times. The going back is just the obsession. The compulsion is to go to do the act. Even though they're aware that it's irrational, the fear that something bad will happen as a result of not doing it is greater than the embarrassment of doing it. The compulsion part of obsessive compulsion is a persistent, irresistible, and irrational urge to perform an act or ritually repeat. Repeatedly. Individuals know the act is senseless, but cannot resist performing it without experiencing intolerable anxiety. Anxiety is relieved only by doing the action. The person cannot resist performing it. It is very time-consuming, and it interferes with normal activities and relationships with others. And that's an important element about obsessive compulsiveness, is that you probably are not carrying on a normal life. It's going to interfere with everything. You're going to be late for work. You're not going to be able to carry on some relationships with some people because it interferes with normal activities and relationships with others. 75% of people with obsessive compulsive disorder involve cleaning and checking. It reflects superstitious thinking of things that must be done to ward off danger. I read about a woman who had a particular connection between numbers and her children's ages. So she went shopping. She wouldn't be able to pick the 6th item because that would mean she'd have to pick the 6th item on the shelf because that would mean she would protect her child from death. That if she picked the 5th item, her child would die. And so she had all sorts of connections of numbers that when she went shopping, she had to pick that number of item on that shelf. It was a terrible experience that she went through. And she knew it was irrational, but she could not do it. So with obsessive compulsive disorder, 2 to 3% of the population, and it's very similar rates reported in Canada, Puerto Rico, Germany, New Zealand, and Korea. The causes, some people have more of a predisposition. It could be early autoimmune disease, strep infection, changes in the brain caused by an infection. Twin and family studies indicate genetic factor, and genes affecting serotonin are suppressed. Genes affecting serotonin are suspected of causing obsessive compulsive disorder. Most commonly used are antidepressant drugs that increase serotonin levels are often helpful. Now, somatoform disorders you will have heard of before, but by the different terms typically. These are disorders in which physical symptoms are present due to psychological causes rather than any known medical condition. People with somatoform disorders are not faking illness to avoid work or other activities. It's the psychological disorder. So hypochondrias, a person preoccupied with their health, fear their physical symptoms are the sign of some serious disease. Despite reassurance from doctors to the contrary, they're not convinced when medical examinations reveal no problems. Symptoms are not consistent with known physical disorders. Doctor shop, going from doctor to doctor, looking for someone to agree with what they're feeling, seeking confirmation of their worst fears. They're not easily treated, and they have a poor chance of recovery. Now, conversion disorder, on the other hand, is a person who suffers a loss of motor or sensory functioning in some part of the body. Loss has no physical cause, but solves some psychological problem. They may become blind, deaf, unable to speak, or paralysis of some part of the body as a way of compensating. And again, this is psychological in nature. There isn't a physical cause for this. Now, dissociative disorders, these are mental escapes. Disorders in which, under unbearable stress, consciousness becomes disassociated from the person's identity, his or her memories of an important personal event, or both, providing a mental escape from the very difficult, intolerable circumstances. So, dissociative amnesia is complete or partial loss of the ability to recall personal information or identity of past experiences. Cannot be attributed to forgetfulness or substance abuse. It's often caused by traumatic experiences and can be caused by a situation creating unbearable anxiety, causing the person to escape by forgetting. Victims of 9/11 tragedy were discovered in mental hospital Victims of 9/11 tragedy were discovered in mental hospitals months later with dissociative amnesia, brought to hospitals with no identification, and they couldn't recall their names, their ages, their addresses, and could not recognize parents, family, or friends. Do not forget how to carry out routine tasks, mind you, but basic personality remains intact. Another form of dissociative disorder or dissociative personality disorder, multiple personalities. This is also known as dissociative identity disorder. Two or more distinct, unique personalities occur in the same person. Severe memory disruption concerning personal information about the other personalities. In 50% of the cases, there were more than 10 different personalities existing in the same person. Change usually occurs suddenly and during stress. The host personality is in charge of the whole body most of the time. Alter personalities may differ radically in intelligence, speech, accent, vocabulary, posture, body language, hairstyle, taste in clothes, manners, handwriting, and sexual orientation. In 80% of cases, the host personality doesn't know alter personalities. Alter personalities have varying levels of awareness of each other. Lost time or periods with no memory will alter the personality. Usually begins in childhood, rarely in adolescence. It occurs based on 90% for women, and 95% of those people who have dissociative identity disorder have a history of severe physical or sexual abuse. Now, the examples that I've shown you here up in the above, the 3 Faces of Eve, is a woman who, this is a true story of a woman who was had 3 personalities, very different personalities. And Sybil, I think she had 28 different, including children and male personalities. And she might have as much as a year go by where Sybil wouldn't know what happened over that year. Another personality had lived the life during that period of time. Now, these are far more rare, but other examples of psychological disorders. Okay, that's part 1. Pretty complex and pretty interesting. It makes some people's lives certainly more challenging than what we might experience in our own lives. All right, let's end this one, and we will begin with part 2 for next week. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Bye now.